On October 28, 1726, the book known today as Gulliver's Travels was published as Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. A mock work of travel literature, Jonathan Swift's famous novel is a far deeper work than one of just Juvenalian and Horatian satire, or more than just a children's cartoon story. It is an indictment against the prevailing spirit of Enlightenment philosophy and utopianism, an esoteric defense of Christianity against its Enlightenment critics, and a prophetic vision into the future degeneration of humanity in following the dictates of the natural philosophers of modernity. Swiftian irony is one of the great joys of the work, and irony is, of course, one of the great joys of Swift's entire literary corpus. And irony runs replete through Gulliver's fall and degeneration through his story, not to mention the shifting narrative voice of Swift and Gulliver, leaving the gentle reader to dissect if they are reading Gulliver's voice or Swift's authorial wit. But where traditional literary narrative has the traveling protagonist return home to comfort and love, Swift's Gulliver returns home deranged and a hater of humanity. This is a far cry from being one of the greatest lovers of mankind, as Gulliver says when he initially arrived in Houyhnhnmland. Gulliver's journey to hell and bringing hell back with him can be broken down into two parts. There is the voyage to Lilliput and Brobdingnag. Then there is the voyage to Laputa and Houyhnhnmland. The voyages to these places, part 1 and part 2, totaling 4 different journeys, amount to the basic dichotomy and division of the work. While all 4 journeys are inexorably interlinked in a journey of decline, Lilliput is more the dialectical pair to Brobdingnag as Laputa is to Houyhnhnmland. When Gulliver arrives, shipwrecked, on Lilliput, he is tied down by the 6-inch men and women of the island who view him, naturally, as a great threat. The other, the stranger, the foreigner, is always met with suspicion. While the Lilliputians have a certain vigor and ingenuity to them, they are ultimately, as revealed over the course of Gulliver's time with them, contemptible creatures. Their smallness is meant to represent their lacking in virtue and finer qualities in life. They are puny, they are small, they are small-minded, they are small in outlook, they are small in heart. After all, despite what Gulliver had done for them, they come to condemn him as a traitor, out of vindictive jealousy, so as to punish him as a result by cutting out his eyes, or at least that's what they attempt to do. For putting out the fire at the royal palace in the most humorous of ways, and therefore saving the emperor's palace, Gulliver is condemned by an ancient law that prohibits the discharge of any liquid inside the palace. For saving Lilliput from invasion and advocating peace between Blefuscu and Lilliput, where the people flourish in peace, the Lilliputians condemn Gulliver as a traitor, especially since Gulliver didn't let the Lilliputians indulge in their fantasy of imperial conquest and domination at Blefuscu's expense. The condemnation for treachery is magnified in Gulliver's flight to Blefuscu, simply on account of his want to have his liberty restored to him. The Lilliputians in Gulliver's flight from them, are cast as ungrateful people. Gulliver's bigness, here in a moment of irony, really comes out. He was the bigger man physically, but also spiritually and morally. We see that Gulliver is kind and, of course, far-sighted in wanting to help the Lilliputians, but they are small by contrast, condemning him as a traitor for all the good he did for them. Where the tininess of the Lilliputians show their shortcomings, the largesse of the Brobdingnagians magnifies their imperfections. No Brobdingnagian is without flaws, all perfectly on display for Gulliver to see, much like how no human is not without the stain of original sin. But Swift's genius is in a dialectical role reversal of Gulliver between Lilliput and Brobdingnag. Gulliver is now the equivalent size of the Lilliputians from earlier and is placed in their shoes in his journey to Brobdingnag. But where the tiny people of the past, for all their shortcomings, saw Gulliver with a certain awe and majesty, even if they condemned him as a traitor, Gulliver sees the Brobdingnagians as ugly, disproportionate, and marred. The Brobdingnagians are no gods to Gulliver, as Gulliver was to the Lilliputians. This is because the Brobdingnagians are the incarnate Europeans of Swift's own time. The Brobdingnagians are also experiencing a technological revolution. This is made clear by the fact that Gulliver is nearly killed by multiple machines, feels alienated and isolated at every turn in the farmer's home, despite their fairly generous care of him, and by the fact that the Brobdingnagians examine Gulliver under intense scientific scrutiny. The Brobdingnagians represent the Europeans of the Enlightenment, the men and the women who are embodying the scientific revolution, putting everything under the intense scrutiny of science, and using technology to benefit their own lives. The movement to Laputa is beginning. In fact, when the Brobdingnagian wise men inspect Gulliver, they conclude, by the dictates of natural philosophy divorced from divinity, that Gulliver is a freak of nature. While Swift's satire of Brobdingnagian society is the beginning of his long-winded criticism of materialist philosophy and what we now call in the 21st century scientism, there is also an ironic, symbiotic understanding between Gulliver and the Brobdingnagians. Both see each other as freaks of nature. Gulliver, due to the largesse of the Brobdingnagians, is attuned to their flaws, scars, and diseases. The Brobdingnagians, due to their intense examination of matter, with only themselves to judge against, conclude Gulliver to be a freak accident, despite his form and rationality matching him with them. This is a defining moment in the work. Through Gulliver, Swift states that the Brobdingnagian assertion that he is a freak of nature is, quote, exactly agreeable to the modern philosophy of Europe, end quote, thus again linking the Brobdingnagians with contemporary Europeans, the Europe of Swift's time in the early Enlightenment. In other words, the emerging materialist philosophy of the early modern period will eventually do away with the incarnate humanism of Christian anthropology and conclude humans to be freaks of nature and no different from other animals. How prescient, all things considered, when you consider the fact that Swift was writing in the 1720s, and 300 years later, this is exactly where we are now. There is nothing special about humanity. We are freaks of nature. In fact, we are the very threats to nature. The lack of beauty and proportionality in Brobdingnag is equally reflective of the emerging scientific outlook of the new science. In putting nature up on the rack of interrogation, as Francis Bacon advocated, the interrogation of nature reveals all of nature's flaws. Nature is not beautiful. Nature is not proportionate. Nature is not in harmony with anything. Everything is flawed. Beauty cannot survive the withering scrutiny of a purely mechanical and reductionist disposition. Hence, where the Lilliputians looked up to Gulliver with some sense of awe and wonder, the Brobdingnagians looked down at Gulliver as a freak, and Gulliver looks upon the Brobdingnagians the same way. The directionality of vision is a subtle importance in shifting consciousness from seeing awe and wonder in nature to condemning nature as freakish and ugly. The Brobdingnagians may share a sense of classical natural right, duty and obligation to Gulliver, symbolized by their care of him despite his being a freak of nature, but that is not the discovery of modernity, but the inheritance of the classical tradition, which is quickly being lost in the modern scientific project. The downward plunge of history and the degeneration of man is now beginning. Despite returning home for a brief rest, Gulliver accepts pay and advancement to go on yet another journey, leaving behind his wife and children. And this, of course, is a moment in which Swift is recognizing the power of commerce and money to strip men away from their families and their homes to go on some grand adventure. The advancement of commerce, exploration, and industry is too alluring for Gulliver and the life he has with his family, all of which must be sacrificed for the sake of progress. While the Lilliputians and the Brobdingnagians are dialectically paired with each other for reasons hitherto explained, there is a connection with the Brobdingnagians and the Lilliputians, as also hinted at, insofar that the Lilliputians are the apex of the scientistic and mechanical mathematical outlook that we encountered with the Brobdingnagians. But the journeys to Laputa and Houyhnhnmland are better dialectical contrasts with each other, paired with each other precisely because of the hyper-rationalism exuded by both societies and the detriments that such a worldview has on humans. The Lilliputians and the Brobdingnagians, for all their flaws, especially the Lilliputians, still treat Gulliver, at least at times, with some dignity and some respect. They treat him with classical natural right. He has duties to them, and they have duties to him. This completely disappears, of course, once we enter the purely scientific worlds and the rationalist worlds of Laputa and Houyhnhnmland. There is even greater irony involved in Gulliver's travel to Laputa. Though a city that is high in the air, as if in the heavens, its inhabitants are deformed and fallen in a far more grotesque way than even the Brobdingnagians. Gulliver's travel may have taken him upward in a physical sense, which ought to have been an allegory for spiritual ascent, but it has taken him downward in that spiritual and interior sense. The distorted eyes of the Lilliputians represent the distortion of man's vision, clouded by the arrogance and pretense of scientific rationalism. They can no longer see straight. There is no morality to them. They are lost in pure scientific speculation and materialistic domination. Moreover, the distinctiveness of the Lilliputians and the Brobdingnagians, again despite all their flaws, is now reduced to homogenized sameness in Gulliver's entry into Laputa. As Gulliver recounts, he had never, quote, seen a race of mortals so singular in their shapes, habits, and countenances, end quote. It is in Laputa and the Laputans that Swift begins his blistering satirical criticism of the Royal Society and their scientific and mathematical obsession, notwithstanding that Swift perfectly sees the exhaustive logical end of this outlook, atheism. And the Royal Society today, of course, in the 21st century, is a bastion of materialistic atheism. Everybody must look the same, everybody must think the same. Again, consider the fact that Swift is writing 300 years ago. How humans, under the tyranny of pure science, would become a race of mortals so singular in their shapes, habits, and countenances. In terms of knowledge, the Laputans consider only mathematics and natural science discoveries as counting toward knowledge. Nothing in art, the humanities matter. The only thing that matters is facts, math and science, nothing else. The wealth of knowledge that comes with the arts, culture, and tradition is meaningless to the Laputans, except for music, but that's only because of the supposed mathematical symmetry that music can produce. They only like music because music is mathematical, not because music is pleasing or beautiful. Furthermore, through their mastery of nature, the Laputans have turned nature into the plaything of man. Again, Swift is far ahead of his time in seeing where the utilitarian mathematical mindset ultimately leads. Far from discovery just for the sake of knowledge, the Laputans turn their knowledge of nature and its movements into tools for their own lust of domination, often terrorizing other people with their mastery and manipulation of nature through their technological power. Despite the scientific prowess of the Laputans, they lack common sense and civility, much like the scientific assholes who live in the 21st century. The flappers that attend them and do all the now mundane tasks of daily living represent common sense in a world that has drifted away from common sense. Yet those who embody common sense are slaves to science. Swift fires all the cannons in ironically showing how a materialistically obsessed civilization, the Laputans, lose all common sense and cannot function without a subservient race of dispossessed toilers. Additionally, family life is entirely lacking in Laputa. The men are concerned only with their work. They leave their wives feeling alienated and estranged, which causes them to engage in adultery. But the men, unable to see clearly, or lacking, of course, the common sense of the reality of their own existence with their wives, either don't know or don't care about the cries and depression of their wives. Again, Laputa is a world where kindness, compassion, and emotional wisdom does not exist. Laputa, then, is a highly atomized society, which is to say no society at all, because a society is built on togetherness, relationship, friendship. The Laputans also live extremely hollow lives. They are empty people. They have no art, no culture. They are only obsessed with science and technology, and they use that science and technology to terrorize and enslave others. It is this hollowness and sterile rationalism that the Laputans exude, which pairs them with the Houyhnhnm, Houyhnhnmland being the last great place that Gulliver descends to. The Houyhnhnm are a satirical parody of the hyper-Stoic rationalism of Spinoza and the other modern philosophers who assert that only deductive reasoning is the rationality that we should pursue. Nothing else matters. Rationalism everything, rational arguments only, rational consideration, reason, reason, reason. And we will learn in Houyhnhnmland the ultimate terror and the genocidal intent of pure rationalism. It is here in Houyhnhnmland that Swift is also making fun of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Noble Savage. Swift is far from a man of the ancient world. He is, in fact, a man of the modern world. He recognizes modernity for what it is, a hollow, empty place where rationalism, science, and technology lead to terror, terrorism, and the want to exterminate everyone and anyone who doesn't share with the rationalist ideology. The Houyhnhnm are singularly rational animals, divorced from all passion, just as the Stoics say men should be, and just as the hyper-rationalists, the new Stoics of Enlightenment Europe, are also saying men should be. They are the final descent into this brave new life of dead bodies, which the modern scientific project is leading man to. Hyper-rationalist, body-only, passion-denying, hunks of thinking meat and matter, that is all you are. And again, how many assholes of the scientific ideology tell you exactly that? You're just a piece of meat and a body with a brain. Swift's brilliance in this respect is captured by the fact that one of the most passionate animals, filled with thumos, horses, are now depicted without passion. Of course, anybody who is familiar with the horse knows just how passionate and energetic that animal is. The Houyhnhnm have the form of horses, but lack the spirit, the essence of horses. There is, of course, another animal in this world that is supposed to be filled with passion: humans. The loss of passion in the Houyhnhnm represent the loss of passion in humans, in the neo-Stoic push for hyper-rationality as the only good in of itself, rather than love, and, of course, the emerging scientific philosophy, which is asserting that humans are exactly the same as animals. Thus, Swift allegorizes hyper-Stoic and hyper-rational humans as horses. Swift's Christianity ultimately cannot be divorced from Gulliver's travel. At the surface, the book doesn't seem to have anything to do with religion. The fourth book, however, has almost everything to do with religion and theological anthropology between the lines, which is known to anybody who is educated in theology. The modern project of anthropology is, as Swift knew, a wholesale rejection of the Christian understanding of man. It is a rejection of his fallenness, a rejection of his uniqueness, a rejection of his lovingness, all at once. The rejection of fallenness, leading to wild ideas of perfectibility, were soundly satirized at the end of the third book, when Swift lampoons the supposedly rational want for immortality, and through the Houyhnhnm, who think reason alone is capable of human empowerment and salvation. The rejection of man's uniqueness and particularity is shown in Gulliver's time spent in Laputa, where all humans, the Laputans, are singular masses of blandness. While the Laputans lack the ability to love, but still seeking love, the Houyhnhnm are now entirely divorced from passion itself, seeing passion as something that is wholly incompatible with reason. So love is entirely eviscerated from Houyhnhnm consciousness. There is no such thing as love. Thus, the Houyhnhnm language has no word for compulsion, since compulsion is unbefitting a supposedly rational animal. Gulliver entered Houyhnhnmland, a lover of his native country, and a self-professed great lover of mankind, as he says. In his dealings with the Houyhnhnm, he comes to hold his native country in nothing but contempt, and likewise comes to view humanity with scorn. Ashamed that the Houyhnhnm consider him a Yahoo, the degenerate hominid species analogous to humans in Houyhnhnmland, Gulliver falls for prideful supremacism in thinking himself above the herd. As he says, I expressed my uneasiness at his giving me so often the appellation of Yahoo, an odious animal, for which I had so utter a hatred and contempt. I begged he would forbear applying that word to me. The allusions to St. Augustine's Confessions and City of God in the fourth book is even more apparent as Gulliver slips into the sin of pride, like the Stoics and Porphyry, whom Augustine critiqued in his works. Gulliver is like Porphyry, a man who claims to be dedicated to the pursuit of truth, as the Houyhnhnm are, but who rejects that which is self-evident because of his egotistical pride. Truth cannot be what I don't want it to be. So too has the same fate befallen Gulliver, who becomes the primary target now of Swift's satire, more so than even the despicable Houyhnhnm. While Gulliver may have been taken over by the false rationalism of the Houyhnhnm, the gentle reader should be able to see through the veil of the Houyhnhnm disposition. There are no marriages of love in Houyhnhnmland, only marriages, if you could call it that, of convenient breeding. Life is produced by breeding, purely for genetic purposes. Life is advanced through eugenics, as the dictates of pure reason, so-called, demands. Future generation of Houyhnhnm are specially bred, with the intermixing of the best male and female Houyhnhnm. Most egregiously, the Houyhnhnm are shown to be genocidal when they take up the question of exterminating the Yahoos from the entire earth. Swift's subtle deconstruction of the Houyhnhnm exposes the immorality of hyper-rationalism and the anti-humanist position that must come from a purely rationalist and scientistic worldview. If man is nothing but a body, greedy, and a destructive animal who has no harmony with nature and reason, as represented by the Yahoos, what is to stop the self-proclaimed arbiters of reason, those tyrants of rationalism, from culling undesirables for the sake of the earth? And again, consider how prescient Swift is. He is writing this 300 years ago, and today, in the 21st century, we hear these arguments all the time, how we should only breed by eugenics, selecting the best and the brightest among humans, how anybody who is irrational and too passionate must be denied basic rights, how we need to kill hundreds of millions, even billions of people in order to save the earth. And all of that is made by supposedly rational argumentation. As the Houyhnhnm contemplate killing all the Yahoos for the sake of the earth, Swift incorporates many direct allusions to the fall of man from John Milton's Paradise Lost. The educated and cultured gentle reader would have been familiar with these references, is now caught between Swiftian and Gulliverian voices. Who is really the fallen and degenerate race here? The supposedly hyper-rational Houyhnhnm, who Gulliver has fallen hand over feet for, or the Yahoos, whom the Houyhnhnm despise out of prejudice for being irrational creatures? But we don't exactly know what they are like. We are only told what they are from the perspective of the Houyhnhnm. The Houyhnhnm account of the expulsion of the first two Yahoos from the mountaintop, an allusion to the fall and expulsion of Adam and Eve in Paradise Lost, is not tied to the Yahoos, but tied to the Houyhnhnm, who are considering wiping the Yahoos off the face of the earth. Swift ties the fall of man not to the Yahoos, but to the Houyhnhnm, who are genocidal in their intent. The reduction of man to just a rational animal is the degeneration and fall of man into utter insanity. When Gulliver finally leaves Houyhnhnmland, teary-eyed and overwrought with grief for having to depart company with such noble animals, Gulliver returns home, disgusted at the sight of his wife and children, who thought him dead, and greet his arrival with tears of joy as passionate and loving animals, the very joy and passion that Gulliver was taught to hold in contempt. There is no special homecoming for Gulliver. Gulliver shuns his wife's affection for him and cannot stand being around Yahoos, which he has now taken to calling all humans he encounters back in England, despite the gentle nobility, compassion, and kindness shown to him from Don Pedro to his joyful wife and children and neighbors. Gulliver's sin of pride reaches, of course, the point of blasphemy, where he makes a mockery of the Eucharist in his separation from his family at dinner, as he says, "To this hour they dare not presume touch my bread or drink out of the same cup. Neither was I ever able to let one of them take me by the hand." Not only is this a blasphemous mock of the Lord's Supper, which is an invitation to communion, it also highlights the misanthropic and atomistic attitude of Gulliver. He doesn't want anyone to be around him. He doesn't want to share in the beautiful life that he can have. Gulliver shuns his family and human relations for 2 horses he buys and spends all of his time with them, preferring their company and imagining them as the rational Houyhnhnm and neighing with them, thinking he is communicating with them. Gulliver has literally become now an animal upon his return to England. He is a horse. He thinks he's communicating with the horses. He is neighing with them. He would rather be a horse than a human. This is not an isolated reality contained to Gulliver. Swift is warning that England will become a den of blasphemy and animalization if she continues her degenerative direction, epitomized by the direction her intellectuals and leaders in politics and the Royal Society are taking the country. And yet again, this is made even more incredible given Swift saw this emerging future in 1726. The degeneration of man is completed by the modern project, which bore its weights down on Gulliver, who succumbed to the unbearable weight he initially was able to fend off in his earlier travels. The animalization of man culminated in Gulliver's transformation into an imitator of the Houyhnhnm, which is no imitation of nature at all, because nature is hollow and vacuous, as the Enlightenment physiologists, scientists, and philosophers asserted. Gulliver's estranged relationship with his wife and children ends on the pessimistic note that love and joy are not possible in this brave new world where beauty, passion, and the sacred have all been stripped away. Thus, Gulliver's Travels is, in its Swiftian genius, a work that actually defends the importance of beauty, passion, and the sacred, the love that makes life worth living, against the rationalism and the scientism with its relentless attempt to destroy everything, which would ultimately bring the destruction of man. Gulliver is destroyed by the end of the work. Yet this need not be our fate. We can choose love and joy. We can choose beauty and passion. We must listen to what Swift is saying in between the lines so that we do not end up like Gulliver, neighing with the horses of the wild, thinking that is all we are.